Finfinay News Network, FNN News, and I am your host, Sibel. Today we have a very special guest back on the program, Dr. Mohammed Hassan. Dr. Mohammed Hassan taught African and world history for more than 25 years at Georgia State University, from where he retired recently. He specializes in Ethiopian and specifically Oromo issues, and he is the author of several academic publications, most recently The Oromo and the Christian Kingdom of Ethiopia, 1300 to 1700. Professor Mohammed Hassan, welcome to the program. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much, Sibel. It's a pleasure joining you.
Thanks. So we'll launch into our first questions here. Firstly, I wanted to ask about your specialty in history. So I'm wondering, how has Oromo history led up to this present moment? Specifically, what factors of Oromo history are present in the current conflict?
That is a very good question. It will take me probably 2-3 hours to finish. I'll try to sum it up in probably a few minutes. Let me put it this way. The impact of history on the current Oromo condition. For your audience, let me first state the Oromo lived as independent, sovereign people for centuries. They had their own governments, a number of governments, and they lived under their own laws. Under the laws they made themselves, they traded with their neighbors. They were, without any exaggeration, powerful people. And they were people who respected themselves and respected by their neighbors. One very important point, which most people most probably may not know, is I'm talking about people coming from the Horn of Africa. In the 18th, 19th, the first half of 20th century, the Oromo language was the lingua franca of trade in the region. It was the language of basically trade from the Sudanese border to Somali border, from Wollo in the north, southern Wollo in the north, to northern Kenya. It was a very important, large language in the area. And I will explain later on why I emphasize about the importance of Oromo language. I said the Oromo lived as independent, self-governing, sovereign people. All that changed as the result of the conquest of the Oromo. That conquest has direct connection with what is happening today. The conquest, of course, really took over a long period. It was not a short conquest. For instance, the central area of Oromia, the region of Shawa, the conquest started in the 1820s, very long time, almost 200 years ago, and it was completed by the grandson of the man who started the conquest, and that grandson was King Menelik of Shawa, northern part of what is today Shawa. And the conquest, as I said, was long, especially in the 1880s. It was really very brutal, and the conquest was accomplished through guns imported from outside. And you can clearly see a connection with the outside world. In different areas, the Oromo really tried, as most human beings in the world, when foreign powers come to invade you, people always resist. And the Oromo people definitely resisted in many areas, especially in the region of Arsi And just to mention what is documented, what is history, from 1879 to 1886, King Menelik conducted 7 military expeditions into RC area. And the RC Oromo warriors did not have a single gun, while Menelik's army had, most of them were really armed with the firearms, and later on they also had artillery and so on. And the resistance was so stiff. In 1886, Menelik's generals adopted a policy of cutting the right hand of men and the right breast of women. Cutting hands was what was practiced in historical Abyssinia, the northern part of the country, and I could give examples of rulers who really cut the hands of their enemies. It's not necessary. What is new about the event that took place in 1886 at Anole was the introduction of cutting of the breast of women, right? Breast of women. There are only 2 examples in the whole of Africa. One was in the Congo in the 1910s, the Belgian Congo, which is today Congo, the vast territory in Central Africa. There, the cutting of hands, legs, and then the cutting of the right breast of women was really practiced, especially those who failed to meet the quotas that were required of them in terms of what they had to produce and so on. And in short, the conquest of RC was really very, very brutal. And after the conquest, one can fairly say modern Ethiopian empire created by Emperor Menelik was based on the destruction of Oromo power. This is not what I state. This was what was written by a prominent Ethiopian scholar by the name of Professor Tashale Tibabu. Basically, this is what is status, which is a reality. Ethiopia was built on the destruction of Oromo power, and the Oromo lost sovereignty. They were no longer able to administer themselves, decide on their own issues, their own history, and basically, once the Oromo lost sovereignty, their culture, their identity, their language, everything was undermined. Their institutions, cultural institutions, religious institutions, they were all undermined. And the Oromo also lost their lands. Once people are conquered, their property will be plundered, and then their land will be taken over. And the Oromo lost their lands. And in the land of their birth, the Oromo became Gabbars. Gabbars means service, basically service, which was practiced all over Europe in the 15, all the way up to 18, and in Russia up to 19th century. There is very little difference between a serf and a slave, essentially. So the Gabbars were distributed among the officials of Emperor Menelik. Let me give you one example. The highest official under a prince was Ras. He received 1,000 Gabbars. Basically, they owned Gabbars are they owned cattle, essentially. And also during the conquest, there were a large, we don't know the exact number, but there were a large number of Oromos who were enslaved. And the conquered people of southern Ethiopia, like the Walaita, like the Sidama, like the Kaficho definitely faced a similar fate. Every official of King Menelik owned slaves as they owned cattle, essentially. Let me give you one example. In 1900, exactly 122 years ago, Emperor Menelik and his wife owned 70,000 slaves. This is not what I say. This is what was written in Professor Richard Pankrest's book, Economic History of Ethiopia, 1800 to 1935. If you are interested, look at page 75, where he clearly states this fact. There was also a relative of the emperor, a very prominent official. The name was Ras Waldegorgis. He owned 20,000 slaves. I could go on mentioning how many thousands of slaves these leaders owned. Let me mention just one final one. Ras Tafari, the future Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, while he was young, his name was Tafari. Ras is the title, basically, he was given. And in 1906, when his father died, he inherited 7,500 slaves from his father. And guess when he freed them, nominally freed them? It was in 1923. On the eve, he was working very hard to admit his country into the League of Nations, basically for protection. And there was great deal of resistance for that country to be admitted to the League of Nations because the slavery was practiced in the country, and it was on the eve of that he gave freedom to the slaves, but they were not given land. They did not know any other occupation. Essentially, they continued serving him, but at least he nominated. The point I want to leave with you is very simple. Menelik's empire, it was an empire. Up to 1974, in my lifetime, the country was called the Ethiopian Empire. It was an empire, basically, and it was based on two pillars. One was the Gabbar system I mentioned earlier, the serfdom I mentioned earlier. The second one was slavery. Both institutions were abolished during the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1936. Even after Haile Selassie was restored to power by the British in 1941, slavery continued in the country. Of all the people in Ethiopia, the conquered people of southern Ethiopia, the majority of which is the Oromo, they have been the most humiliated people in that country. Let me mention the reason why I say the most humiliated. Up to 1974, the Oromo were not even allowed to use their national name. The national name is Oromo. They were called by a derogatory term, which was very similar to nigger in the United States, a term of insult, a term of belittling, basically destroying the identity of population, in many ways similar to kafir in South Africa. It was only in 1974 the name Oromo was mentioned officially in Ethiopia. After that, the story started changing. One other factor, up to 1974, it was not permissible to publish, to preach, to teach, to broadcast in Oromo language. Absolutely not permissible. But in terms of teaching, up to 1992, Oromo children never had the opportunity of learning any subject in their language using Latin alphabet. Why do I mention this? It was the change of government in 1991, which really ended the old order, which was based on assimilation, on Amharadation, basically transforming the elite into something else. And you will see why I'll mention this. Of all the changes that took place in Ethiopia in 1991, what most angered the Amara elite was the establishment of Oromia as one of the 9 regional states.
Mm.
Many feared Oromia is a means, a mechanism for dissolving Ethiopia. The truth is, it's far from that. Since the creation of the Ethiopian Empire, power was never dissolved. The people were subjects to be governed, to be ruled, and they were never considered as citizens. It is not without reason a prominent British political scientist, Ernest Gleaner, he wrote a book in 1982, and in that book he says Ethiopia is a prison house of nation and nationalities, if ever there is one. And it is very true. It was a prison house of nation and nationalities. In that prison house, the Oromo language, every possibility was done to prevent the Oromo language from being used for teaching, preaching, as I have already mentioned. It may surprise you, even today, Ethiopian Orthodox Christian Oromos do not have the right to preach their religion to their members in their own language. Even today, in 2022, they don't have the right to learn their religion in their own language, in their own mother tongue. And I don't know any country in the world where people are prevented from preaching in their mother tongue except in Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
These points, basically what is happening today in Ethiopia, especially since 2018, when Colonel Abiy came to power. Essentially, he came on the back of Aero. The Oromo used Aero and the Karre. They made huge sacrifice over 3 years, probably somewhere between 5 to 7,000 young men and the women lost their lives in the struggle for bringing change, and over 30,000 wounded. And who was the first to brand Cairo and the Karre as manga? Manga is herds, reducing them to the status of animals. It was Abiy, Colonel Abiy, and he targeted them for destruction. And he was very successful. Today, there are more than 50,000 Pharaohs and Karres in prison. The worst part, several of them, it is estimated about 3,000 youth, young men and women were taken out of prison from time to time in the last 3 years. Almost 3,000 were executed. These were individuals who were imprisoned by the government. They were in custody of government, and taking them out, executing them is a crime against humanity. And I don't know any country where this kind of inhuman activities are performed. Why is Abiy doing this? Very simple. Abiy wants to restore the Ethiopia of Emperor Menelik, the Ethiopia that was based on the destruction of Oromo power, Oromo population, the plunder of Oromo resources, the suppression of Oromo identity, Oromo language. Basically, he and his supporters, the Amara elitists, they really wanted to restore the old order. Will the Oromo accept? I doubt it. That is why they resist. And we will be able to talk about that resistance together. Let me just mention one point. For Colonel Abiy, the Oromo language, Oromumma, Oromo nationalism, the Gada system, the Irrecha, all Oromo institutions, these are the words he mentioned. All Oromo institutions are a danger for the future of Ethiopia. Therefore, they have to be dismantled, they have to be destroyed.
Mhm.
This is the leader who is deciding on the fate, the future of population. Essentially, what he wants is destroying everything that the Oromo struggled for the last 60 years. The Oromo started struggle in more organized way in the 1960s. It was the struggle of such a long time which brought about the establishment of Oromia as the regional state, which represents Oromo identity, and basically. And then the Oromos learning, children learning, and scholars writing in their own language. And he wants to reverse all this, basically. The war that he is conducting against the Oromo, as he is conducting, especially as we will talk about it, against the Tigrayan population, is basically for the restoration of the old Ethiopia, the Ethiopia that was created by Menelik. Uh, uh, Today, let me just stop here. Today, Oromia is the battleground in restoring all the Ethiopia. Remember, if Oromia is dissolved, by the way, for the last more than 3 years, there was sustained propaganda financed by Abiy's government. There were individuals who were paid salaries for insulting the Oromo population in public on the media and for calling for dismantling of Oromia.
Mm.
In other words, the humiliation the Oromo were exposed to after the conquest had really continued with much more vigor under Colonel Abiy's regime. Essentially, he wants to be a dictator like the Eritrean president. In fact, he follows his line, and the best way he could do is by restoring all the Ethiopia and to appease the Amara elite. He promised them that he will destroy Oromia, dismantle all Oromo institutions, and then restore Amharic as the only language that will be used in the country, which means the Oromo will not have the right, their God-given right, to use their language for developing literature in their own language, for administering themselves. And this is happening in the today, in these days and age. For the time being, let me stop at this point.
Mhm. Well, that's really fascinating backgrounds to some of the conflict that's going on right now. I'm going to move into a few questions about current events, but please feel free to give any kind of historical context to those issues, since I think that's very useful to understand. Um, so, my first question here is about how the Ethiopian government recently approved a new budget that allocates 90 billion ETB towards the Ministry of Defense. So I'm wondering, Professor, what do you make of this move? Do you think that this signals that Abiy intends to ramp up military action against the OLA, despite his current posturing as though he's interested in peace? And on his part, do you think this is a wise move, considering the precarious economic position that Ethiopia is in right now?
That is really a very good question. Ethiopia does not exist without war. Since 1960s, there was never a time when there was peace. There was war during the 1960s, war during 1970s, war during 1990s, war since then, now in a major way. Why did Abiy allocate additional 90 billion Ethiopian birr to the Ministry of Defense? It was to escalate the military conflict. Essentially, in the tradition of the Habasha, the Tigrayans and the Dahmaras, there is very little sense of compromise, concession, coming together. Enemies have to be destroyed. Enemies are not to be tolerated. Enemies are not to be brought into the circle so that they contribute their share. They have to be destroyed. Essentially, what Abiy is clearly doing is signaling is we will intensify the war against OLA, Oromo Liberation Army, against Tigrayan Defense Force, the war for basically restoring all the Ethiopia that I mentioned earlier. It will simply intensify. Let me give you what I heard just today. Today Abiy is training 80,000 men and women for the war in Oromia and in the northern part of the country, which means really he wants to intensify. Out of the 80,000, this was what was reported on media today. Out of the 80,000, 50,000 are Oromo nationals. People who were abducted from their village, people who were forced into this. Essentially, they are going to be cannon fodders. People who are given training. So far, they have given training for about 2 months. They are, I think, in the third month. And it is this who are trained for 2 or 3 months who will be thrown at Ola, Oromo Liberation Army, who are really in the struggle for years, at least for 3 years, who have been tested. And more importantly, they have to fight against the Tigrayan Defense Force, which is hardened by war over the years, above all, which decimated the previous Ethiopian military establishment. There are estimates that probably about 400,000 soldiers have lost their lives. Essentially, it is a major war, major conflict. By the time all wars come to an end, by the time this war ends, we may be talking about countless tens of thousands of people who will have lost their lives in this struggle. And Colonel Abiy wants to intensify that. The economy of the country is probably in its worst shape. And it is the people, they say inflation is about 40%, somewhere between 30 to 40%. And the people who are most victimized by this is the poor in urban areas. The poor in urban areas. those in possession of power, the wealthy elements, they will be able to survive. The poor will pay price. Recently, I met someone who came from the Finfinne, and he says life is unbearable, especially for the poor. They have nothing to eat. Hundreds of people say, I did not eat today. Please give me something. Just imagine you are traveling on a street and there will be countless number of people who cry, who say, I have not eaten anything since yesterday. Please have mercy upon me. How on earth a government that presides over this invests $90 billion in another phase of destruction? And it shows you how much Colonel Abiy is obsessed with the idea of restoring old Ethiopia, essentially,
Mhm.
because it allows him to be the undisputed dictator of that land. There is no doubt about this. Many scholars, many observers clearly see he is incredibly ambitious man who follows the footstep of Isaiah. What did Isaiah do for Eritrea? He has been the dictator for the last 3 decades. You know, in 1992, there was a better prospect for Eritrea to democratize. And economically, really, there were a number of Eritrean scholars who in 1992-93 talking about an emerging economy in Eritrea. And I naively believed that, and in 1992 actually wrote an article simply expressing the hope for better. I thought Eritrea will be an example for Ethiopia, and it turned to be the exact opposite. Abiy follows in the footstep of Isaiah because he is an incredibly ambitious man. He wants the absolute rule to be the absolute ruler in the country, and in the process, if he destroys the country, I doubt if he cares anything. And he knows so many tricks in terms of capturing the attention of the elite, those who want the restoration of all the Ethiopia. He always say, we will pay for disintegrates. The Ethiopia he wants is the return of all the Ethiopia, in which he is the undisputed master. And so many people lose their lives for the return of that Ethiopia under which I grew up, when even our people were not able to use their language, their name, their national name itself. And this tells you really a great deal about that.
Mhm. So next, I wanted to move on to talking about how one of the big moves that the prime minister has signaled recently is that he wants to start this, what he calls a national dialogue for peace. And for example, the Tigrayan president, Debretsion Gebremichael, has also said that a negotiation between the TPLF and the Prosperity Party through a third party is making progress. At the same time, recent news, 63 different Oromo civic, professional, advocacy, human rights, and community organizations around the world have also released a joint statement urging the establishment of an independent national dialogue commission. However, still, it seems like Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party has been avoiding negotiations with the OLF or the OLA. So, what would an actual national inclusive dialogue for peace look like, and who could facilitate that?
Wow, that is really a very beautiful question.
Thank you.
National dialogue.
Yeah.
National dialogue within Ethiopia is the dialogue among those who want to restore the old Ethiopia, nothing else. It is the Prosperity Party and its allies. There was a list of names that was on the internet even this very afternoon. That list does not include leaders of Oromo Liberation Front, leaders of the Tigrayan Liberation Front, leaders of Oromo OFC, Oromo Federalist Congress. Essentially, the most important organizations are excluded. To be honest with you, I don't entertain even for a single moment Colonel Abiy wants a genuine national dialogue. What he wants is to create a facade of national dialogue. Those who support the restoration of all the Ethiopia, basically the Ethiopia of one language, one culture, one identity, which excluded the majority of population, that in which Oromo identity will never be reflected. In fact, today you may think I am exaggerating. It is far from it. To be an Oromo is to be is in the process of being criminalized. Essentially, you have to say I am an Ethiopian, not Oromo. People can say I am an Amara, I am a Somali, and so on, but the Oromo can't say I am an Oromo. And it simply reflects the depths of humiliation after a century and 40 years the Oromo are still exposed to. Ethiopia that does not include, that does not reflect Oromo identity, the country will not survive because the Oromo people will really no longer, will not accept continued humiliation, the humiliation that has lasted for a century and, 440 years. That history will not continue. No matter what, our people are struggling for maintaining viable Oromia. Essentially, they wanted to dissolve the regional state of Oromia. Essentially, the Oromo will be the losers if Oromia is dismantled. And I doubt the Oromo people will accept that and then simply once again become the thieves, not second, not third, but the worst citizens in that land, citizens who are always insulted. Even today in Ethiopia, you can insult the Oromo, and anybody can insult the Oromo, as one lady did only 2 days ago on media, insulting the Oromo as barbarians, as people who hate living in urban areas. They want to exclude the Oromo from urban areas, essentially. And Abiy's dialogue, national dialogue, is really nothing but a project for appealing to the West for financial assistance. Let me explain this point. When Abiy came to power, there was a great deal of euphoria. There were assistance. In fact, long before Abiy came to power, always 40% of the Ethiopian government expenditure was covered by assistance, by money that was coming from Europe, from the United States, from Canada, from other areas. Is there any country in the world where 40% of the government's budget depended on the money that comes from outside because of the war, the genocidal war that was conducted in Tigray? Truly genocidal. When this thing comes to an end, the world will will learn the incredible human tragedy that has taken place in Tigray, the genocides that were committed there, and not to mention what happened in Western Oromia, in Walaga region, in Guji zone, where people are burned with their houses, when daughters are raped in front of their parents, where wives are raped in front of their husbands. Even the Derg regime, the most cruel regime, did not implement these kinds of things. Today, the Oromo people are killed right and left. There is not a single day when Oromos are not killed in a significant number. Just to add one important point, in Wallo region, Oromia region, there has been 75 documented drone attacks in that small areas. The goal is to destroy population, destroy them, essentially. And that is happening. Destruction of population. Drones are used in Walaga, in Shawa, in Guji zone, essentially. They are used in Tigray. Will they change the course of the battle? I doubt it. I doubt it. Especially in Oromia, they move, the Olas move in small units, 5, 10, 15. They don't have tanks, they don't have heavy artillery. Drones hurt the public. They destroy property, they kill civilian population, as they have been doing. But in terms of stopping the progress of Ola, that will really not happen. The one superpower in the world is the United States. They fought in Afghanistan for 20 years, rained drones, missiles, everything. Ultimately, the United States lost the battle and they left. And you can't destroy population. Abiy's agenda is for eradicating, destroying the Tigrayan population, for destroying the Oromo population, because he sees them as an obstacle for restoring his ideal Menelik's empire, essentially.
So actually, you mentioned the influence of money from Europe and America here in this conflict too, and that's a perfect tie-in to this next question I wanted to ask about international relations. We covered, of course, America removing Ethiopia from the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And the potential ramifications of that. And then recently on the program, we also looked at how a drone that was used to kill over 50 people in Tigray recently, a Politico investigation, an American news investigation, found that was a Turkish drone. So my question here is, does the Prosperity Party regime need Western money to survive? And if so, how will they get it? And then is the money and support from the United Arab Emirates, China, and Turkey enough to sustain this war? And then, what interests, what role do the interests of the West and America play here? And what is your impression of America's response to the Ethiopian conflict?
Well, again, this is really a very detailed, a very good question. Let me start with the last part, with the American interest. The West and America, their interest in, especially the U.S. interest in Ethiopia, is more of strategic. It is, a large country, densely populated, the second densely populated country. Their interest is essentially strategic, and then the fear that if such a densely populated country disintegrates, it will overwhelm the refugees fleeing from Ethiopia from the carnage in the land, will overwhelm neighboring areas. Many of them may ultimately end in Europe, probably many ending in Red Sea as well as in the Mediterranean Sea. They want us to prevent that possibility. But the current American administration in one level is really misguided. They think if Abiy is removed from possession of power, the country will disintegrate. That is the exact opposite. If Abiy cannot live without war, essentially all his life he was a military, recruited into the military at the age of 14 because he was not a fighting age. Guess what they used for? He became a security agent. He was sent to the west, Wallaga area, where he spent 7 years hunting down Oromo Liberation Front fighters and their supporters. His life, everything, his loyalty to the TPLF leaders was really based on the number of people he destroyed, essentially. He demonstrated to them that he is the most loyal servant, and that is why they actually lifted up and then promoted him, ultimately becoming, he was a radio operator, a security agent, and he has the blood of so many people, essentially, especially in Wallaga area in the west. To return to your question, will the PP survive on the money they get? I suspect Turkey will not give a single cent. China will not give any money. Iran will not give any money. And the United Arab Emirates loaned them money, probably about $1 billion at the beginning. That was because there was very little foreign reserve in the Ethiopian National Bank, and most of what they get from the outside in terms of the drones, these are how would I say, they have to pay for it ultimately. The next generation will pay for all the drones that have destroyed the lives of so many people, so many property. It is this and the next generation that will pay for those drones, essentially. Abiy, as I have said, Abiy will not be able to survive without war, and he will continue with this war. And if the Western powers clearly understand this, probably Ethiopia will be served better without Abiy. If he is removed from possession of power, there will be most likely genuine national dialogue, which includes everyone who had a stake in the future of that country. And there will be better prospect for the country remaining together through that open national dialogue. You know, the whole purpose of national dialogue is to bring people with different ideologies, with different outlook, with different political objectives. They discuss every aspect and ultimately may reach a consensus about the future of the country. Abiy's national dialogue, as I mentioned earlier, is nothing but the magnitude. He knows there will never be any genuine national dialogue there. He established them. He controls the agenda. He controls everything. This is not a national dialogue. national dialogue has to be conducted by individuals who have the trust of everyone, who has acceptance, and it is the people who set the agenda for national dialogue, not the government. If it is if the government sets agenda, what is to be discussed, what is not to be touched. If the government decides who should be included, who should be excluded, that is nothing but a party. It is simply a project. To me, it is a project for buying time because he is trying to build up his military at the same time to show to the West that he is seriously involved in national dialogue. I hope the West they know about this aspect. I hope they will really not buy this cheap, cheap propaganda.
Mm.
I hope they will not waste their money in terms of, this man has been given so much money in 2018, 2019. What did he do? He squandered it in the preparation for war for 3 years in building parks.
Hmm.
Human beings do not eat drones. Human beings need food, and there is very little food. I am told just today there is very little fuel in Finfinne.
Hmm.
There are no tires to be found. There is no money for introducing, importing spare parts. Essentially, the economy of that country is gradually, it may collapse. And the whole project of this national dialogue was on the part of Abiy and the people who surround him, who are united by ideology, is for preventing the collapse of the economy. But everything he does leads to the collapse of the economy. Remember, hungry people always rise up against their oppressors.
Hmm.
So far, Abiy was able to manage to control through his propaganda, through his tight security. There may come a time when the dam breaks, and then, like all governments, Abiy may face the fate of others who came before him.
Hmm. That actually is the perfect tie into my last question here, which is if you see the possibility of a new regime in the near future. And since your specialty is history, of course, I'm curious if you see sort of a historical precedent for this or any kind of patterns in the history of Oromo people. So, what could a new regime look like in the future? And do you think there's a possibility that it could give a greater voice to Oromo people?
Well, that is an excellent question. Thank you for this. Um, a regime that gives greater voice for the Oromo and other people in the country is a regime that is based on federal arrangement, highly centralized. The old system of Ethiopia never tolerates devolution of power. Power is centralized. That is what, although even today Ethiopia had the name of this federal government of Ethiopia, there is no federalism. They have already destroyed Oromia, other regional states. It is Abiy who appoints regional states. I could give you countless examples. The president of Oromia was appointed by Abiy, that of Somalia, that of Afar, every area. Essentially, he has become the king, appointing. It is like old Ethiopia, where power was centralized in Finfinne, and then everyone will be appointed and controlled from that. This is a recipe for disaster. The the only government under which the Oromo and others will have voice, legitimate voice. Their rightful voice is under federal system where people have the right to administer themselves, to be masters of their destiny in their state, owners of property, essentially, administering themselves, using their language for their administration. Will that kind of governments come? It is a difficult question. If the struggle continues, there will be two outcomes. One, Abiy's regime will be defeated, and then probably different forces will come together and will be involved in massive national dialogue to agree whether they will live together in a better environment. That is a possibility. If Abiy is able to crush everything, which is not really, I don't assume it even for a second, he will not be able to reverse. He will not be able to reverse the struggle of Oromo people of 60 years because he wishes it. Our people have died for their rights. They will continue dying, struggling for their rights. No doubt about that in my mind. And I doubt if the Tigrayan people, the TDF will be, defeated. No way, because it is the power. It reflects the power of the Tigrayan population, the people who were targeted for destruction. I don't really know any country in the world where a neighboring country, Eritrea, Somalia, and then the Amhara militia, the national, the federal force, they all embark on destroying one region. It's just unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. And I hope they will never escape with this crime against humanity, with the genocide they really committed and what they are committing in different areas of Oromia, in the west, in the center, in Guji area. How about the Karayu, where their Abagadas were slaughtered by the order of the security chief of Oromia regional state, essentially. What did they do? The only thing they did was to remain independent. Abiy, he dismantled the most important Oromo institution, the Gada system. Gada leaders were traditionally greatly respected. It was an institution that shaped the Oromo society. He defiled that. And today, Abagadas are paid salaries. They serve as the cadres of Abiy's regime. No other Ethiopian government did what Abiy is doing to this institution. Essentially, the core of Oromo identity is dismantled before our very eyes because he believes if this is destroyed, there will be very little that will hold the Oromo together. Even greater pain and suffering, and they will survive Abiy, definitely. He is waging war against the Oromo population, against the Tigrayans, against the Kemant, against the Agos, against a number of population in that country. And there is no example of any leader who wages war against against population, and then he survives. Always it is the people who ultimately wins, and therefore I am very optimistic about the future. If our people want to live with the rest of the population of Ethiopia. Their rights are respected. They become the masters in Oromia. That is, if they wish, they can live under fully autonomous federal system. And if that is not the option, it is up to the Oromo people. If they say, oh, we want to establish our own independent state. In fact, the crime Abiy is committing against the Oromo is driving them into that part. Personally, I would love if the whole population of Ethiopia under a better situation if they live together. If they live together, that is, their will. If they wanted to live together, if they want to separate, basically, whether a better government will be under Abiy, Abiy will not be able to bring peace and what he calls prosperity to that country. All what he brings is war, death, destruction, unbelievable poverty. And the outside world will really need to understand Abiy is a curse on that country, essentially. Just imagine within 3.5 years, a man who was the most popular to becoming a genocidal leader. What a disgrace. And it is his ambition, his unbridled ambition. He is so ambitious to be the dictator. Let me conclude by saying leaders with a substance in their head, knowledgeable leaders, seek power for improving human condition, the living condition, for creating equality among people, for transforming subjects into citizens, for respecting the rights of their population. Why does Abiy seek endless wild ambition for nothing but for just imitating the example of Isaias? What did Isaias do to his country? Today, Eritrea is better, slightly better than Ethiopia. Abiy, to me, is making a bigger Ethiopia into a smaller Eritrea in terms of really destroying every aspect. His ambition most likely will destroy Ethiopia as well. No people, those who think he will restore all the Ethiopia, everyone will realize later on, mark my words, Abiy is not good for any people in that country, any people. All what he will establish is his own dictatorship. And the dictatorship always ends in tragedy. Always, always.
Well, I think that is all the time we have for today, but this has been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for coming on the program to talk to us, Dr. Mohammed Hassan.
Thank you so very much for giving me this opportunity.
And thank you also to our audience for watching FNN News. We really appreciate your viewership, and we'll continue to update you on events in Ethiopia and issues going on with Oromia. So once again, thanks for watching FNN News, Finfinne News Network, and I am your host, Sibel.